The part that I play on the board is rather like the part that I am playing here today of linking between John's standard cost models and the markets, providing the link between two different worlds, really. But just before I go on and talk about what I was going to say, I was talking to a dairy company person after hearing John's explanation then, and the comment was, why doesn't the board just tell companies where to put their milk? Because you've obviously modelled all this, you've gone to this great detail, every cost is in there, it's obviously very fair and equitable. Why doesn't the board just tell companies where to put their milk? Because there should be no skin off their nose if they're properly reimbursed. Well, as John said, that's all very well if you've got one factory. But if you've got two factories and only enough milk for one of them in the shoulder of the season, it's a very different picture. John's whole system was based on, as he said, starting from a greenfield site, saying, will we as a company build a cheaper casein factory or a more expensive cheese factory? After 30 years, his modelling system puts the company back on a level footing, regardless of which they chose, whether it was the more expensive one or the cheaper one, they reimbursed accordingly. And it's very, very different when a company's got two factories. And that's where we can start to influence the product mix that the industry makes and which the board's going to sell. The point which John finished up on was the fixed cost recoveries that are inherent in his payments. He's paying so much per tonne of product. Some of that is for the variable cost, the energy and the packaging. A big chunk of it is fixed costs. And those fixed costs per unit of milk, per kg of fat, vary from one product to another. And the sort of size of those numbers is summarised there. $1.48 for a whole milk powder plant. And that's quite a big number, isn't it, compared to $5 for the milk. You're actually getting quite a lot for the factory and about another $1.50 or so for the variable costs. So the amounts paid in John's purchase prices towards the standing cost of the company are quite large. If that's the price that the company's being paid, essentially by their market, which is selling product to the board, the company is going to use its milk to earn as much as it can from its market. So it's going to allocate the milk in the order of those fixed costs payments which are included in the prices that they're being paid. But before we start talking about that, one thing we have to go back and look at is the autonomy of companies to allocate their milk. As Warren said earlier, companies have the responsibility to build the plants, they make the investment decisions. They also have the autonomy to allocate their milk, well, at least to this relatively short list of the open order products. If companies make any volume of products in that list of cheddar cheese, skim milk powder, lactic casein and butter, the board has undertaken to buy it. And the reason for that is that the board, as the sole seller, as the sole exporter of dairy products, has agreed as a sort of back-to-back undertaking to the industry that it will also buy all the volume. It would be a bit rich to say that the board is the sole exporter and companies can't export, but the board's not going to buy it either. And as an agreement, one of the fundamental underlying principles of the industry is this back-to-back agreement that the board's the single seller, but the board will also buy all of your product, provided it's on that list. And that's a fairly short list. From time to time, people wonder whether other products should be added to it. There is no wish to extend the list. But equally, it is important to have it because it's yeah, sorry.
And how much of that open, in terms of volume,
yep,
What would that constitute our industry's production?
3 years ago, I was asked that question, went around the product divisions, and it was 20 to 25% of each of the product groups were in those specs. I did the same thing 6 months ago, and it's about 5%, 2 to 5%. What's happened in the last 3 years is each of the product divisions have gone into their specs and said, look, if the customers are asking for particular product from a factory, there must be something special about it. And they've rewritten their specs to be much more focused on what the customer is perceiving. And these used to be the main trading product of the board. They are now very clearly the default if we can't do anything better. But it's still very important, as one of the principles of how the industry works, to give the companies the right to allocate their milk into these products. So they can say to the board, I'm going to make skim milk powder next week. What spec do you want me to make? As of right, I can make spec 6000. Would you like me to make something else? And it's very important in terms of evening up the balance between the board's responsibility and the companies, that the companies have that as of right. They can make those products. Having spent their money, built their plants, it's their right then to allocate the milk accordingly. John mentioned square curving, and I've summarised how that might look for a theoretical company that might have two factories, a cheese factory and a casein factory, separated by a big mountain range, both the same size, both on the milk curve. The earnings on that company's milk would just be the average of those two, 111 cents. But if they've got them all on the one site, both factories on the one site, they can fill up the cheese plant as quickly as possible, keep it full, and then close it, fill up the casein plant as late as it has to be opened, close it as quickly as possible, and run out the season back on the cheese plant. And the earnings for the company on their farmer's milk is then higher than it would be if they had just followed the milk curve. That's not very dramatic. Going back a couple of seasons, the difference between cheese and casein was 35 cents. Now it's a mere 10 cents. It's closing the gap, but that is what is driving companies and allocating their milk. And we alter that in order to get the product mix that the board wants. The way in which we alter it is by changing the order of the fixed cost recoveries that I put up earlier, by imposing differential penalties on product that we don't want. This was the list I had before, starting up whole milk powder 148 cents, and it's a happy coincidence that the order that John's models come out with is very close to what the market wants. We would be changing it, as you can see, or as I'll show you, in order to align it with what the product wants. We want the industry to fill up its whole milk powder plants, casein and whey plants, skim milk powder, and cheese. Well, we certainly want quite a lot of cheese, but there's a limit to it. When we reach the limit of the volume of cheese that we want to sell, we put a differential penalty on, say, we'll take half the cheese at the standard price, we'll penalise everything above that volume to make it less attractive than casein, so that companies will allocate their milk so much to cheese, then casein, ahead of penalty cheese. And that's the way that the cheese penalties in the differential system works. Going back to the square curving, the company left to its own devices at the standard purchase price would square curve cheese ahead of casein, but we set penalties on cheese in 4 periods through the season at different percentages of their square curve volume, and by altering these, the height of these, where the penalty cuts in, we control the volume of cheese which the board buys. Those differentials can be set for 4 classes of product, which are essentially the 4 types of factories. Essentially, the differential system is oriented to getting the milk into the powder dryer, into the cheese factory or the casein plant. Not any more specific than that. So that in brief is how the differential system works. We'll go on to talk about the product mix. The best product mix for the industry really depends on where you're looking from. From the company's point of view, it is the highest fixed cost recoveries from the market that they're selling to, which is the standard purchase prices. From the industry's point of view, it's the mix of products that will give us the highest returns from the world market. And we use the differential system to bring those two into line. From the industry's point of view, we start by looking at the strategic markets that we want to provide products for and the strategies being followed by the marketing people. The principal ones that are in the board's strategic plan are that we will minimise our reliance on butter by taking every opportunity to grow cheese and whole milk powder. And we will also value markets that have a long-term future rather than just the highest price on the day. About 80% of the industry's milk goes into that allocation. The last bit, the last 20% or so, is allocated on the basis of the short-term returns. Looking at the returns that we use, we don't just take the farm gate returns from sales, because as you saw before, the different factories take different amounts towards their fixed cost recoveries. So if we work on the marginal earnings from sales, we're taking the price free alongside the ship for the next 1,000 tonnes of product, and we take off the board's variable costs, which is largely storage and transport, company's variable costs, energy, packaging, and that's the number that we look at, the contribution to fixed costs plus the milk value. Warren showed before the staircases for the different markets, and this is a sort of stylised version of the same thing. In allocating the industry's milk, we're first going to supply the products to secure and strategic business. And after that, we will allocate milk to the spot sales, tenders, and if necessary, disposal markets. And the differential system works on essentially the spot sale end of things. The picture here is quite different for the different products. The main driving factor is that for butter, about half of what we make can be regarded as strategic and secure. New Zealand market, UK quota, that's about it. The other half we're trying to sell. And whole milk powder, similarly, about half of it is out here because it's chasing opportunities to sell instead of butter. Cheese, there are not so many opportunities in the spot business. Skim milk powder and casein essentially don't have the luxury of chasing spot business, and their core business, or all of their volume, is in the core sales. The sorts of allocations, of course, are the quota markets, New Zealand cheese sales, milk powder to recombining plants, some of the newly developing markets that we're chasing, even though the returns this year aren't even up to average, but we're in them for the long haul, would be regarded as strategic business. On the spot business, we might have, as we had towards the end of last season, an opportunity for skim milk powder to Japan at a very good price. We found the milk for it. Firstly, looking within the milk powder division, but if not, asking for it to be reallocated from other products. If any opportunity like that comes along, the milk will flow into it until we finish up with the last 1,000 tonnes of each product returning the same earnings. Just to show how we managed to do last season, this was the picture in February, March. Looking at the returns we would get from the next 1,000 tonnes of product in each class. With casein, we made about 70,000 tonnes. The last 1,000 tonnes was selling for $4,000 a tonne, and the contribution to the industry, $7.66. That compares to a farm gate price on a fully absorbed basis of about $5. Skim milk powder, whole milk powder and cheese, all within 16 cents of each other at the edge. And by checking that we got them to align like that, shows that the product mix, or the optimum product mix for the industry, was achieved. If any one had been higher than that, noticeably higher, then milk should have flowed into it, and there would have had to have been a good reason why that hadn't been achieved. Looking at the product mix that we're planning for the coming year compared to last season, cheese is going up about 4,000 tonnes. Whole milk powder, we want a 30,000 tonne jump in whole milk powder, 30 or 40,000 tonnes. Skim milk powder the same. Casein coming backwards. Last season they just had no alternative but to absorb all that extra milk. And butter, hopefully less being made next season than last year. Again, the mix for the coming season with the volumes in tonnes, broken out also into where the industry's protein's going. And you can see that it's fairly well spread between the four product groups. But on the milk fat, we've got quite a different picture. Despite all the efforts to reduce the reliance on selling butter and promoting cheese and whole milk powder, we've still got nearly 2/3 of the industry's fat being sold as butter and AMF. One of the things that this means is that if the milk supply is growing by, say, 3% a year, the cheese and whole milk powder will have to grow by 9% to absorb that extra fat if we're going to stop the butter production from increasing. The objective of the differential system, the first objective is to achieve the product mix, and for all the criticisms of it, at least you can say it works. The secondary objective is to reward flexibility. Last year there was a review of the whole system to polish it up, and they looked to see how we should be applying these differentials. There were several alternatives suggested, but they settled on a mix submitted by companies at the start of each season, which will probably square curve cheese and casein ahead of milk powder. This was clearly not the preferred product mix for companies because they're putting casein up ahead of powder. So we're going to change the name to the initial product mix, which might not sound a great achievement for a 6-month study by an industry committee, but we're going to change the name. And partly it clarifies the reason why casein is exaggerated and milk powder has been minimised in their preferred mix. That is to achieve that secondary objective of rewarding flexibility. If we want to do that, companies are asked to demonstrate their flexibility, so they demonstrate how much they can go the wrong way, and we reward them for coming back the right way. And that's achieved by a premium on milk powder. The timetable for doing that: in April, the board's marketing plans were assembled and the industries submitted their preferred mixes. In May, differentials were advised to companies, and this week they will be responding to those differentials with their manufacturing programs. If they are in line with what the board requires, the differentials will be confirmed. Otherwise, we would alter the differentials and go round another loop for another month. And then as we go through the season, we monitor production on a monthly basis, how they're doing according to their program, and the industry's, the market situation. And we have the ability to alter the differentials or the target mix as we go through the season. Again, looking in a somewhat stylised way at how companies are submitting their preferred product mix, they would allocate milk first to casein and whey and milk powder, fill them up as quickly as possible, fill up cheese. If they can't process all of their milk into that, they would make casein without whey processing just through the peak and get it closed as quickly as possible. The differentials that we advise for each period would look something like this. We'd say we'd take half of that square curve cheese at the standard price. Every tonne above that, we would impose a penalty of $80 a tonne, or about 18 cents a kg fat. Milk powder will reward any increase in milk powder, any extent to which they can move milk into powder, by $20 a tonne. Casein is already the least attractive one under the standard purchase prices, so there's no need to penalise that. The milk will flow out of that if the companies can possibly manage it, unless it is whey linked, in which case we want it to stay there. Caseinates are totally under PA control from the board, so there's no need for differentials against them this year. The response that we would see from companies, again in a somewhat stylised way, would have the companies switching milk out of cheese and into casein. Milk that they would prefer to leave in their cheese plant because it's paid higher. They are required, or their response to the threatened cheese penalties is to switch it into casein. The single product cheese companies have no alternative but to go on making the cheese and paying the penalty. They actually get a debit note for the extent of the penalty. So even the multi-product companies earn less as a result of the differentials. The success we achieved last year, and I'm looking forward to the same sort of achievement hopefully later this week, we were aiming for 126,000 tonnes of cheese. They had offered us over 200,000 tonnes. When we set the differentials, the response was very, very close to the target. We got more whole milk powder offered than we wanted, but again, that's under PA control. We got more casein than we wanted, but that was because the industry was limited in its powder capacity. So that shows that it works. The impact on companies from the differentials, the South Island companies are the ones that notice it. They paid about 12 cents off their company payout to their farmers as a direct result of penalties having to be paid on their cheese. The ones that could move milk into milk powder and collected the premium were earning something like 1 cent for their suppliers. So it's fairly small beer on that side of it. Some people say, well, if it's so small, why does it get so much attention? Other people say, look, we achieved the product mix and we only move around $2 million, isn't it a great success? And I think that that's true. So that's the differential system which we use to get companies to allocate their milk into the factories and make the product which the board wants to sell. Just want to touch on the fine-tuning system that we use of diversions, which again gets a lot of attention when we're negotiating and paying a diversion around the board. So it's important, I think, just to understand quickly the principles of what's involved. If towards the end of the season we see an opportunity where the market is offering us, say, 50 cents a kg more for milk powder instead of casein, and we see a company with going on making casein when there's a powder dryer up the road, not full, we can say to the company, why aren't you making powder? And they say, well, the transport costs would be 40 cents a kg. The standard purchase price only offers us a difference of 32, so we're worse off. We're better just to go on making casein and save the transport costs. The board is in the position to take the wider view and say, look, if the market's offering us 50 cents as an industry, we will pay a top-up of the 8 cents towards the transport, and we'll pay you an incentive of up to 5 cents for the trouble of organising it and disrupting your labour force perhaps. So for a 13 cent payment to the company, the industry can have that milk made into milk powder, earn the 50 cents, and the whole industry is better off by 37 cents. The reason why diversions get so much attention is that we've gone and bought 1,000 tonnes of milk powder at a higher price than all of the other 130,000 tonnes that we bought on the standard price. This 1,000 tonnes, we've paid $200 or $300 a tonne more. Now, why? Why was that company so lucky? Why were they asked? It's certainly, companies watch each other and watch the board, and there's a series of procedures that we go through in signing off these things because companies in the whole industry watch them very closely. Just to summarise then the main points of the differentials and product mix system, companies have the right to allocate milk to their factories. They build the factories, they allocate the milk. We have to get the price signals in the right way to allow them to choose their response. The differential penalties and premiums are overlaid on the standard purchase prices in order to achieve the response from companies that lines up with what the market is paying the board. So in that way, the differentials are part of the industry's product purchase system. And the whole system is overseen by PAC, and it's written down and signed off by the companies and the industry rules.
Thank you, Pat. Just before we break, I'd like to cover one aspect of the